Before we begin, tell me where you're reading this from in the comments, and if you like stories that sting and soothe in equal measure, hit subscribe. Now, settle in. This one gets messy. Evelyn Royce pressed the cold metal of the pistol against the window of a saloon table, aligning a very precise aim at a very weak place beneath a man who thought himself clever. She was small. No one in Hollow Creek would have guessed she could reach his shoulder, yet her voice was hard as flint. "Try to take my daughter, and my husband won't have to do the crushing," she said. "I'll make sure I do it myself." The man laughed too loudly. He hadn't seen Thaddeus Boone filling the doorway. Wordless and immense, Thad's hulking silhouette fell across the threshold like a coming storm. The grinning confidence on the slitherer's face drained as he realized his options had narrowed to two: the pistol on his chest and the iron hand at the door. This story begins in a church and ends at a saloon table, but its heart lived between those 2 points, where fate was dealt across a poker board, where vows were spoken under sweating rafters, and where two people taught each other how to keep what they'd been given. When Reverend Dalton intoned, "You may kiss your bride," Evelyn felt as if the chapel itself leaned forward to watch. Thaddeus Boone, tall as a lamplight, broad as barn doors, bowed until the difference between them was absurd. His hands, capable of wrapping a feed sack with a single grip, came to rest on Evelyn's arms with deliberate gentleness. The kiss was brief and public, polite, and across the pews, a dozen tongues began their own saloon gossip. Evelyn had been 21 for 3 weeks when the marriage was arranged. Her uncle Amos had lost Dowling Ridge in a single ruinous hand of cards to Thaddeus Boone, ranch, livestock, and custody of his niece. Thad had offered a compromise that sounded like mercy: marriage to keep the ranch in the family and provide a protector, charity to some, a lifeline to Evelyn. The alternatives: destitution, a brothel, the raw cruelty of a frontier with no kin, loomed too large to ignore. She said yes because she had to. She said yes because the man who now stood in the chapel beside her could have taken everything and left worse. At the reception, the barn smelled of hay and lantern smoke. Men who had danced all afternoon turned their jokes into a chorus of lewd insinuations as whiskey softened their tongues. "You sure she's old enough?" Red Mallory called out, testing the bull. Thaddeus did not move fast, but his calm was an unspoken threat. "She's 21, he said, and his hand found Evelyn's beneath the table, covering it entirely. "She's my wife. Mind your manners." Later, 3 women cornered Evelyn by the outhouse. "You'll need to be prepared," said Mrs. Gable, and what passed for advice in Hollow Creek was a ragbag of half-truths. Drink enough, whiskey, use oil, use lamps, a revelatory catalog of crude how-tos from a town that mistook cruelty for counsel. Evelyn fled, not because she could not imagine the worst, but because she refused to be frightened into silence. She found Thaddeus among his men. When his eyes slid to her, something in his face softened like a hand opening. "You look pale," he said. "Are you ill?" "Just tired," she lied. That night, in a room that had once been her sanctuary and now belonged to a stranger with boots the size of buckets, something like understanding began. Thaddeus's eyes had a way of taking up space the way mountains take up sky, absolute, inexorable. And yet, when he spoke of restraint, of learning, his voice held a man who had practiced silence long enough to know its value. "I don't want to force anything," he said, rotating a thought between them like a coin. "We're married. It's your right to say stop." Evelyn stared at him. She had been told terrible things about him, stories embroidered and doubled until the truth was almost lost. But she had not met the man beneath the rumor. She stepped closer because courage is often a thinner garment than fear. "I'm not made of glass," she said. He half smiled, then that imperfect expression curled into something fierce and shy. "Then we learned together." He said her name, Evelyn, like a promise. The rest of the night was an awkward choreography, 2 people negotiating bodies and temperaments. There were tears, stumbles, crude jokes swallowed before they surfaced, laughs that felt like small triumphs. He moved with the gentle deliberation of someone who had to measure every breath. She responded with a bravery that tasted like grit and honey. By morning, when sunlight pooled on the floorboards and Thaddeus dressed with the clumsy grace of one who must sit to tie boots, the house no longer felt like an alien vessel. It felt inhabited. Our house, he murmured when she told him she'd managed household chores since she was 14. The possessive could have been a snare, but in his mouth it turned to a vow. The first test came sooner than either of them expected. The Grady brothers, mean, dangerous, and predatory, had been sniffing around since Amos lost the farm. They came while most hands were on the range. Evelyn was alone in the kitchen when the oldest, Rafe Grady, swaggered up onto the porch. "You got a way of sending a message," he drawled. She loaded the shotgun Thaddeus had insisted she keep by the door, and when Rafe pushed too far, she put a blast into the dirt at his boots. "Next one's higher," she said, steady-handed and small as a hawk. The brothers left with teeth bared and dust in their wake. When Thaddeus rode back hard, word having reached him by a dozen anxious riders, his face was thunder. "You could have stayed inside," he said, and his voice held both scorn and gratitude. She had stood her ground. He had ridden to protect what was his, what was theirs. The exchange of roles stitched them closer. He was her shield, and she was his chosen partner, not a possession displayed for the gossip of men. Violence kept visiting. It always did on the frontier. But for every blow fought outside, there were 100 quieter battles inside, learning to make a bed so it held both of them, adjusting chairs, finding angles that fit. The town watched and speculated. Some bet on how long, until the size difference wrecked them. Some muttered things that would have been cruel if they weren't so small and bitter. But as months folded into each other, rumors softened into a new kind of respect. Evelyn learned to ride hard and shoot straight. Thaddeus learned to be gentle in 1,000 small ways, handing her a cup with his whole palm, leaning down to her level, listening. When she shot an arrow at a tin can to prove a point, or strapped on a pistol and rode alongside men who snorted in disbelief, those same men watched their assumptions crumble. She was not a lamb. She was a woman who could be tender and vicious by turns, who could bake bread and hold a rifle with equal command. It was 3 months after the wedding that the Grady brothers came back with worse intent. This time, they brought more than swagger. They brought malice. Marcus, Rafe's younger brother, confronted her in the barn, where he reached for her like a lecher stepping into a doorway of sin. Evelyn reacted the only way a woman of her life could: knee, pitchfork, fight. The barn exploded when Thaddeus filled the doorway, an avenging bulk of a man who looked like a mountain with a temper. "Run!" he told Marcus, and Marcus ran with the speed of a coward who'd lost his bearings. Thaddeus's relief was palpable, turning into pride as he gripped Evelyn close and told her she had taught him how to be brave in a way gentler than fists. She had taught herself, too, to be loud when needed, to take a stand. The town began to change its tune when Thaddeus invited Red Mallory, the man he'd fired at the wedding, to return. "We need all hands," Thaddeus said simply. Red came hat in hand to apologize and to work. They planned defenses, posted watch, and for the first time, Evelyn felt like not just a protected thing to be guarded, but a voice in the council, a strategist. Men listened. When the cavalry came, Captain Hale and his grim-faced men, something unexpected happened. Hale brought news. The Grady brothers were part of a criminal ring that had robbed an army payroll wagon. The chase that followed was bloody, rough, and raw. Evelyn rode, learned more in 3 days of tracking than in her entire earlier life, and stood shoulder to shoulder with Thaddeus under a sky that sniffed of gunpowder. They found the Grady camp in a canyon. Thaddeus chose a precarious route, and Evelyn climbed like a squirrel, her smallness granting her handholds a larger man could not reach. From above, they pinned the Grady men, while Morris, Captain Hale, ordered the men up. Bullets sang oath-like in the canyon, and when Marcus tripped a stick of dynamite, Thaddeus lunged and pulled Evelyn to safety. Rock and dust rained. The world narrowed to an afterimage of the man she already loved cradling her like a child. When the dust settled, the Grady boys were dead or captured, and Hollow Creek had a new legend, not merely Bull Boone's tiny bride, but the woman who had shot straight and fought hard. Captain Hale, once a skeptic, tipped his hat to Evelyn and called her Mrs. Boone with something like respect. They came home changed, quieter, closer. That night, when the hush of the house wrapped around them, Thaddeus admitted the thing they had both been circling. "I loved you," he said, as if saying it made it truer. Evelyn had loved him too for a long while, since the chapel, since he'd disarmed her uncle without turning cruel, since he'd guarded her through a night of terror. "I love you," she told him, and their lives shifted in the ordinary miracle of mutual confession. Not every story bends toward bliss. A twist came in long cardboard envelopes and the arrival of Aunt Beatrice from Denver with a lawyer. A family secret unearthed. Evelyn's mother, it turned out, had left a small fortune she'd meant for her daughter at marriage. $20,000, a mountain of change for their kind. Her uncle Amos had known, had turned his face away, had once tried to sell her to the highest bidder. Now there was the temptation to leave, return east, buy a life apart from the scars of the frontier. But nothing in Evelyn's chest leaned that way. "This is our life," she said, correcting Aunt Beatrice when the woman worried aloud. "I choose Thaddeus." The lawyer could only blink as the woman who had been a pawn turned into a partner, sturdy and sure. Aunt Beatrice watched them for 3 days before she left, softened into approval. "You've made him civilized," she admitted grudgingly. Evelyn laughed. "He made me brave," she said. In the margins of that claim was the truth that would bind them. Each had been given the courage the other lacked. Then came the news that would change everything again. Evelyn was with child. The knowledge hit her in a kitchen full of oven heat and the smell of biscuit. And when she told Thaddeus, the horseshoe dropped from his hand. He stood at the barn door like a man seeing the limits of his world. "A baby," he whispered. Then fear warred with wonder in his face. What if... He never finished. They both filled in the blank with every horror their imaginations could gather. A child too big for a small woman's pelvis. A child bound to a life of awkwardness. Evelyn held his hands. "We will make room," she said, and for the first time in months, she felt no tremor in her voice. The pregnancy progressed under the sky's watchful eye. The town that had mocked them now placed bets on whether the baby would be normal and whether Evelyn would survive the birth. Dr. Avery watched her as if she were a science experiment and declared with cautious optimism that Evelyn's body adapted, that the baby, though large, might be delivered with care. But nothing prepared them for the day. Labor began early, with blood and a terror that tasted like copper. Thaddeus drove like a man with a single destination and a prayer in his throat. For long hours, Dr. Avery fought to save both mother and child, and when the baby came, a girl, 9 pounds and 3 ounces, dark-haired and wailing, Evelyn's strength emptied into a black exhaustion. She hemorrhaged until Dr. Avery's hands moved like a machine. And for 2 terrible hours, Thaddeus bargained with the sky. He promised anything to have her back. When she finally opened her eyes, a small, perfect child lay in Thaddeus's arms. They named her June. Thaddeus whispered to the infant about her mother's bravery and kissed Evelyn in a way that seemed to stitch them back into a life of 3. The doctor told them gently that there would be no more children. Her body had paid too high a price. Evelyn looked at Thaddeus, at the small curl of a finger on her chest, and in a quiet iron voice said, "June will have to be enough." Thaddeus wept and promised she would always be enough. Time, as it does, thinned the sharp edges of fear. They returned to a home modified in Thaddeus's hands to fit them. A cradle that could hold his broad embrace, steps so Evelyn could climb, chairs reinforced. Red and the men hammered, fitted, and made a nest. Life settled into a rhythm sweet and ordinary, and June grew, a mix of her parents and more than coincidence. Evelyn's fire with a sturdy frame. Trouble, however, has a way of finding small vulnerabilities. A well-dressed man from Chicago, Silas Wortham, all tooth and perfume, arrived claiming more inheritance, paper seals promising $50,000 if Evelyn traveled east with her child to prove lineage. Something smelled off. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. The telegrams he dispatched to old contacts revealed the truth. Wortham was a predator, a kidnapper with a record for abducting wealthy women for ransom. Evelyn did not let the town's chattering mouths decide their fate. She walked into a saloon, wearing a calm like armor, and sat at Silas Wortham's table. He laughed at her at first, thinking she was a soft mark. He did not notice the check of steel in her eyes until the barrel of her pistol had warmed the spot beneath his belt. "Choose," she said. The choice was humiliating. Leave town tonight and never return, or face a different kind of exposure. He fled, dignity and papers left in the dust. And Thaddeus, who had been silent vigil across the street, came to her with the small, private pride of a man whose wife had become a warrior in her own right. Years moved on like a steady gait. June grew into a child who surprised and pleased both parents, taller than some, stubborn as a weed, gentle when she wanted to be, and fierce when need be. The town's story about the marriage shifted into something less snide and more fond. Hollow Creek favored their saga now, the giant who married the small woman, the ranch that prospered because the two of them kept watch together. Thaddeus learned to be careful with dates and with his temper. Evelyn learned the arc of patience and when a gun was honest and when it was theater. On the third anniversary of their strange and forced union, Evelyn stood in the porch light and said, "If you ask me, that stupid hand of cards was the best disaster that ever happened to me." Thaddeus kissed her temple. "And I'll never thank your uncle," he said. They laughed, and in the laughter was the human contentment of two people who had built something not tidy, but true. There were no cartoon endings in Hollow Creek. Wolves still prowled, men still schemed, and the land demanded its due in work and sweat and sometimes blood. But inside their reinforced home, a tiny woman with a pistol, a big man with hands that could crush or cradle, and a child who would one day learn that courage comes in every size. There was safety, love, and a future stitched by choices. If this tale found you between two worlds, curious and stubborn, drop a note in the comments. Where are you reading from? If you like stories of unlikely families and fierce tenderness, subscribe. Share this with someone who appreciates love that fights for its place.